Welcome to today's PDAC webinar, Critical Minerals in the COVID-19 Era, Supply Chain and Survival, the first of 16 sessions in the Fasken series. My name is Michael Barassa. I'm a partner in Fasken's Toronto office and a member of the PDAC Program Committee. This is Fasken's 11th annual PDAC seminar series. This year we are doing it virtually like PDAC itself, which starts a week from today. We have people joining us today from all over North and South America, from the UK, Europe, South Africa, and Australia. We are also broadcasting this on YouTube Live. Once again, welcome everyone. And now I'll turn things over to Andrew House, who is a partner in our Ottawa office and co-leader of the National Security Group.
Thank you, Michael, and good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on your location. We're joined today by participants from around the world to talk about an issue which impacts us all, and as such, we will look at both the risks and opportunities associated with complex interdependence in a time of resource scarcity. I'm Andrew House. I'm co-leader of Fasken's National Security Group, as Michael mentioned. This has been a strange year. Some of you haven't been to your offices in months. Some of you are joining today from your basements, your kitchens, your family rooms surrounded by home improvement projects, pets and family, and all the wonderful madness these things entail. And all of this is now completely normal in this, the new normal. While we're separated this way and unable to be together as we normally would at PDAC, there's an opportunity to think hard about how we got here and how we can avoid being here again. A very significant part of that answer lies in supply chain security and resilience, being able to source the inputs needed to make the things we need to survive and thrive, life-saving medicines and devices, electronics, things like electric vehicle motors and batteries, and even the ubiquitous earbuds that let us connect in a forum like this. For those who dare, think back to the periodic table of elements of your high school days, which are the constituent parts of the minerals we'll discuss today. They are neither precious nor pretty, they're simply necessary. Some can only be made in a laboratory. Some can only be extracted from the ground at great risk and expense. Economic turmoil caused by the pandemic has exposed many of the vulnerabilities in supply chains and raised significant doubts about the outer limits of globalization. While I think we are still all free traders, we have felt the edges of the table, so to speak, without yet having fallen off. We are no longer as invested in running lean as being able to run at all, which may mean manufacturing here, wherever here happens to be for you today, or at least stockpiling those quantities of critical goods needed to weather a bad storm, which I think this pandemic surely has been. I'm very pleased at this point to introduce you to a group of people who have been very successful in their own way in weathering their own storms in various parts of the public and private sector, and who have agreed to share with us today their experiences and observations on critical minerals in the COVID era. First, Catherine Raw is Chief Operating Officer of Barrick Gold, and Barrick's executive responsible for North America. She was previously co-manager of BlackRock's flagship mining funds. Catherine has been instrumental in keeping us all on this panel honest in this endeavor, as she has not only worked as a geological field assistant, but holds advanced degrees in the natural sciences and mineral project appraisal. Richard Fadden is the former director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, former Deputy Minister of National Defence for Canada, and former National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers Harper and Trudeau. Next, Jeff Townsend, Chief Operating Officer of Technical Critical Minerals, has nearly 20 years of experience working in the political sphere of Westminster, Capitol Hill, and the Southern African Development Community. His expertise in foreign affairs and international development has led him to advise senior ministers, ambassadors, and national leaders. In 2011, Jeff began the UK's all-party parliamentary group on international mining and more recently founded the Critical Minerals Association and its political platform in Westminster. And finally, Guy Winter is a partner in Fasken's London office. He is recognized for his particular experience in equity capital markets, private equity in VC, public and private M&A, joint ventures, and complex reorganizations in the energy and natural resource sector. Guy is also my critical go-to on all things mineral and mineral related. This is today's panel, and without further ado, we're going to dive into our first theme. You will see that we've organized things on two fronts. The first has to do with risks, and the second to do with opportunities. But first, we thought it would be very useful to have Jeff Townsend take us back to basics in what we've called Critical Minerals 101. Many of you today are joining not as mining experts, but as people who are interested in the topic. And critically, if I may use the term, we're looking at things like missile guidance systems, rechargeable batteries, solar panels, computer hard drives, catalytic converters, MRI scanners, and wind turbines. Each of these things has something in common. They all depend on critical minerals. So Jeff, at this time, take us back to the beginning. What are critical minerals and what do they do? And in so doing, tell us about scarcity of supply in these special elements and what those shortages do to our industries and economies.
Thank you, Andrew. What a wonderful panel to be part of, and I'm really looking forward to the chat. So when we're talking about critical minerals, at the Critical Minerals Association in the UK, we had discussions with the UK government and we created 3 subsets. And I think that's really important because that allows us to have a more streamlined discussion when we talk about critical minerals. So the first one is critical minerals. Those are absolutely necessary for industrial objectives, but also have a supply chain vulnerability. The second of those subsets is technical metals, things like copper. So you need 4 tons of copper for a large wind turbine, 100 kilograms of copper in an electric vehicle. So whilst they may not have a supply chain vulnerability, they're absolutely necessary for the development of this industrial economy and green economy that we're all trying to build. And finally, and one that is very interesting, is strategic minerals. So these are minerals that are either wedded to the defense sector, space sector, or would be diplomatically beneficial to an individual nation. So that's really important, we find, because one nation's critical mineral or one company's critical mineral may be another nation's strategic mineral. And therefore the interactions and the role that the mineral plays is different for each of the actors who controls or needs them. So I think that's a really important starting point. And when we discuss these critical minerals, where are we coming from and why are we interested in them? So taking from that is critical minerals as a whole, why are they important? So if we look around the UK, America, Canada, Australia, there is a shift from a fossil fuel-based economy to one based on green energy, renewables, and high-tech, space-led industry, defense. All of those require critical minerals as a building block. So I understand that in America and in the EU, the UK, there's 35 minerals that are seen as critical. And these differ. What the UK sees as critical is slightly different to Canada, but fundamentally 80% is the same. And I think it's really important, therefore, that we're almost, as we all race towards this new green economy, we find ourselves either in collaboration with or in a race against our partner nations and our friends to find alternatives to the supply chain that we find ourselves in. So finally then, on that supply chain, why are these minerals vulnerable? It's not because they're necessarily rare. Some of them are. Some of them are found spread across the world, but the amounts that they're in each location make them economically not viable to mine. It may be the grades have fallen. So whilst there used to be a lot of them, the grade of that ore is now so low, again, they become less interesting for companies. Or it may be the geographical location that you find them in. So it becomes increasingly under ESG guidance, difficult to access and use those within your supply chain as you build up towards your final product. And I know we'll go into this later, but again, I think when we're talking about critical minerals, we have to take into account the entire supply chain as one. So it's not necessarily the difficulty of mining the product. It might be the difficulty of processing or refining that product, and where there becomes a block in the international access to them. So I think that's a good overview of where we are, and I'll hand back to you now, Andrew.
Jeff, you've just used a turn of phrase which I found really interesting. You said that a particular mineral may be strategic because it's diplomatically beneficial. Can you just unpack that thought? I think that's a very polite way of making a point that has within it some edges, and I'd love to hear more on that.
Hi, Andrew. Yeah, of course. Okay, well, let's look at it from almost two different options. So recently in November, China passed a legislation that allowed to stop the export of strategic minerals, those that they find necessary. And that's been doubled down recently with discussions on blocking exports of critical minerals that are necessary for defense in other nations. So you can see that whilst it may not be beneficial to China and its economy, there's strategic minerals that are beneficial to the US or other nations. And therefore there's been a diplomatic action or a political action taken to reduce the access to those. Equally, recently, President Biden had his executive order on America's supply chain. And the wording in there, 4C, something like that, he talks about, in fact, I've got the paper here somewhere, reports identifying risks in the supply chain for critical minerals and other identified strategic materials, including rare earth elements. So again, there's an understanding from the American side of this, this global race for critical minerals that there are some that are absolutely necessary for our industry or for our defense. And we've overlooked it in times of globalization and pre-COVID. And I think we're now starting to look at it and say, hang on, actually, we may need some of these, and our access to them may not be constrained by geography or technical ability, but may be constrained by diplomatic relations. So I think that when we talk about strategic minerals, it's a really fascinating area to look in. And that's where Dick comes in, I'm sure.
We will get to Mr. Fadden, and I know I'm fascinated to hear his comments on this. I want to turn for a moment to something that Jeff just made reference to, and that's the executive order. We are holding this discussion, fortunately, in the aftermath of new American action on critical infrastructure generally, and critical minerals in particular. President Biden has issued an order which mandates, and I quote, a 100-day supply chain review to identify risks in the supply of critical minerals, including the rare earths. Now, the purpose, we're told, of this order is to determine vulnerabilities related to, and again, I quote, the defense, intelligence, cyber, homeland security, health, climate, environmental, natural, market, economic, geopolitical, human rights, or forced labor risks, or other contingencies that may disrupt, strain, or compromise supply chains. You can see that President Biden and his drafters have gone to great lengths to cover off any and every angle presented in terms of threats to the supply chain or created by supply chain vulnerabilities. Catherine Raw, what's the president after here, and why is it so important? And secondly, when it comes to critical minerals, what's a doomsday scenario for the president?
So what's interesting is Biden is actually taking on a sort of path that the previous Trump administration started back in sort of 2017. And the key, as Jeff's already described, is trying to secure the supply of critical, strategic, important, whatever the word is you want to use, minerals, and ultimately protect the US supply chain so that it's able to secure and grow its economy without the threat of interference from other governments or other actions. And what's interesting is that they're also framing it under the sort of human rights and environmental mantra as well. So they're encompassing a lot of the sort of manifesto points, if that's the word I'd use, that Biden's been elected on, and linking it into what is also a security executive order. What's interesting about it is ultimately what they're trying to do is strengthen domestic mining and processing and supply chains to guard against the possibility of external interference. And the implications of that are enormous because it not only affects the way in which the US government regulates and permits mining, it encourages ultimately an approach to the domestic supply chain that I don't think we've seen really since the Cold War, in terms of encouraging development and encouraging domestic development rather than relying on free trade and global trade in order to solve the market's problems.
So, Catherine, to what extent does this executive order, in your view, achieve the goal for which it was written? Is there anything missing from this order, or is this a step in the right direction? If so, is it a large enough step, particularly as it builds on some things that President Trump did? There are very few things I think these two presidents, past and current, would agree upon. They seem to agree upon on the criticality of these minerals. Are they getting it right, or is there more work to be done?
Well, interestingly, this executive order is really a 100-day review. So it's over the past 3 years we've done a lot of reviewing. There's still not much actually been done. There's a couple of pieces of legislation that's been passed, which is encouraging the acceleration of permitting, for example, in the mining space. But with regards to actually determining key steps to encourage or to accelerate or to invest in these key parts of the supply chain, I still think we're incredibly early days yet in terms of seeing any real action being taken on the ground. And the other challenge, of course, is the sort of opposing forces to some of this drive. So when we look, for example, at what's happening on the ground, we've just seen the Secretary of Interior announce a 60-day moratorium on new permits being issued because they're nervous about any Trump decisions that were made. So at the moment, what's happening is this push and pull, which is there's an overarching strategic recognition that we need to accelerate these issues in order to protect, whether it's the US, the UK, Australia. But particularly for the Biden administration, you've also got this opposing force, which is very much around, do you trust previous decisions, and how are those decisions impacting environmental considerations and other alternative considerations, human rights, Native American issues, all of which impact particularly mining, because a lot of US mining is in the Western United States where a lot of these impacts are occurring. So what's fascinating to me over the next 12, 18, 24 months is how Biden really deals with those opposing forces and actually takes a position. And the administration starts to move forward with some of the key elements of what that executive order outlines. But essentially this 100 days is almost like pressing a pause button, which says, okay, give us 100 days to review it, and then we'll come out with our position.
Guy Winter, give us the view from the UK. How are folks in the United Kingdom reacting so far to this executive order? And is there similar thinking or action in the United Kingdom?
I think definitely through the work of Jeff, indeed, and others in the UK political community and critical minerals industry, there has been a kind of renewed focus on this. We, of course, have been in a sort of political zombie land for the last couple of years with Brexit. And in actual fact, Brexit has probably sharpened some of these issues because in actual fact, the need to ensure that you have a local short supply chain is very much focused by the rules of origin, which will now apply to electric vehicles and to batteries which are exported from the UK. So I think it's fair to say that we're on high alert, but rather like Catherine articulated in relation to the American position, there's a bit of a difference between reviewing the situation and fixing it and building an extremely complex supply chain. I think what the Biden administration and the rest of us shouldn't forget is that there are actually very good reasons why we are where we are today. It's not that China in some way surreptitiously occupied the position that they have in the critical minerals supply chain. No one else wanted to do it. And the reality is that the kind of vertical consolidation that was implemented as a matter of state policy in China in the early 2000s is really kind of bearing fruit today as they leverage that in the high value manufacturing processes around wind turbines and electric vehicles, electric batteries. So you can't really make up a lost 20 years just by having a 100-day review. And so I think I'd probably echo what Catherine was saying, that the really interesting thing will be how far is government prepared to go to intervene in what has become a very distorted market. Will they actually provide the regulatory and economic support to help to develop these supply chains in the Western world?
Thank you, Guy. Still on the topic of threats and challenges, according to the Financial Times in a recent article, China is said to be exploring limiting the export of rare earth minerals that are critical to the manufacture of F-35 fighter jets, so vital to the NATO alliance in particular, and other sophisticated weaponry. The rare earths are central to everything from precision-guided missiles to drones. In fact, we're told that the US Congressional Research Service reports that each F-35 requires no less than 417 kilos of rare earth materials. Now, turning to Richard Fadden, Dick, you and I have worked together for almost 15 years. I know I don't need to encourage you to talk about China and Russia, but I'm going to anyway. How bad could this get? And specifically, what's the worst case scenario for the Western military allies? And how should those allies react? What is their next move in light of what we read in the Financial Times?
I think that the broad geopolitical situation on the planet is actually quite important because it's almost impossible to predict. I'm going to focus on China, but much of what I'm going to say will also apply to Russia and other countries that are run as fiefdoms around the planet. China, I think, looks at itself very much from the perspective of its national security. Anything that affects its sovereignty, political, economic, environmental, or whatnot. And I guess the thing to remember is that its definition of national security is quite a bit broader than the one that we use in the West, even that of the United States. But more to the point, the tools that it has to protect its national security are very broad. They can be used quite arbitrarily. And if you think back a little bit about what China does when it's annoyed, it's not hard to imagine that in this area, it's going to be potentially quite worrisome. I think one of the things we need to remember very much is there's no rule of law or settled rules in China. So what they do and how they do it in the future may well end up being entirely satisfactory to the West, but it's entirely arbitrary when you compare it to the way that we act in the West. And there's not much we can do about that. The last thing I'd point out in terms of detail is whatever is done in terms of the export of critical minerals in China will be as a result of a conscious decision on the part of the central government. There are corporations in China which function entirely on the basis of economics, but when their national security is concerned, they really do take second place to what the Communist Party decides. So I don't think tomorrow China is going to cut off the export of critical minerals, absent a major disagreement with the West. It's more likely that it will restrict them a little bit. It will refuse to sell to one country as opposed to another. So all of this together points to me to the need for the West to get its act together a little bit more than it has in order to deal with the eventuality that the international situation will deteriorate. And that's possible, although not guaranteed. So what can we do about this? And I think one of the things that we need to remember in the West is that China is not Ruritania. There's this tendency on the part of some people in the West to say, well, China's not doing something, but we want to do something about it. China is a significant world power, and our capacity to push and pull, and I include the United States in this, is limited. So what do we do if they do something that we're unhappy with? We negotiate, we impose sanctions, we compromise, absent, a warlike situation, which I hope won't happen. So I think the really worst case scenario is China, because of the broad geopolitical situation, simply says, we ain't exporting any critical minerals. I don't think that's likely, but it's within the realm of the possible. I think we have to remember that China is not our competitor anymore. They're a strategic adversary of the West. and they push and pull according to their own interests. So what can we do in the meantime? I think the first thing that we need to do more than we have, Jeff seems to have been particularly successful in galvanizing the United K government. I can't say that's true of all members of NATO or of the Five Eyes. Does the Canadian government aware of this? At some levels, yes, but it's hardly a priority, and it comes and goes depending upon the issues of the day. So we need to galvanize ourselves to recognize there is a potential issue. And it's a potential issue for the West. It's not just one individual countries. Having done that, I think we need to collaborate a little bit more, the Five Eyes and NATO and others, to make sure that we have a clear understanding, a common understanding of what might happen. Then I think there need to be discussions between the public and the private sector. I'm not suggesting, Catherine will forgive me for even implying that the government will take over what the private sector wants to do, but I think dialogue on these issues is important. The private sector needs to know what the government is thinking and vice versa. And there's a bit of that, but I don't think there's enough of it going on in this area. I think we need to collaborate also on developing more research. Are there ways that we can reduce our dependence on these critical minerals? Can we develop new ones and things of this nature? One of the things that is worrisome today, and I'm almost finished, Andrew, is the deglobalization potential of the planet right now. Because of COVID and other things that you referred to in your opening remarks, borders are rising. They're not going down. You know, the EU is now restricting movement of people. Are they going to move to restricting capital and goods in the future? I hope not, but it's within the realm of the possible. So if that's the case, it seems to me that just relying on good relations isn't sufficient. We need to develop hard, fast supply chain guarantees with our close allies, which involves exploration, mining, the sharing of these critical minerals, and a clear understanding of what happened if something goes wrong. I mean, we've seen under the Trump administration how they've treated Canada in respect of a few issues, for example, the tariffs on aluminum. If you have a treaty binding an international law on some of these issues, you can restrict the capacity for things to go haywire. So in today's world, I think it's clear that no one country can deal with this issue, not even the United States. And I think it's important to realize that. I mean, more power to Mr. Biden and his 100-day review, but whatever he concludes, the entire solution of this problem does not rest with the United States. We have to do this collectively. I guess the second to last thing I would say is, despite everything I've said about China, China is here, it's going to stay, and it's not going to go away. We need to develop ongoing communications on this issue like all others. And lastly, in respect of Canada, we have a fair number of rare minerals. We need in Canada to spend more time, money, and effort discussing amongst levels of government, because Canada is a federal state, and Lord knows that complicates things, and also with the private sector, to ensure that we can develop those minerals either as a contribution to these agreements I was talking about, or indeed as a lever that we can use in developing those shared relationships. So I don't think the world's going to come to an end in terms of what China is going to do, but the potential there for real harm in terms of the movement of rare earth materials out of China is there. We need to prepare for it. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Dick. I don't know whether I feel more frightened or more comforted, maybe a little of both. I thank you for that answer. There's a couple of things I'd follow up with you on. As I think back to my time in government, much of it spent in difficult and fraught discussion with you and other colleagues, one of the things that leaps to mind is how much time we spent in discussion about things like countering violent extremism, terrorism, and countering espionage, and not on critical infrastructure. It was only 5-6 years ago. I sense there's been, even in the last year, such a profound shift. To what extent are these issues of critical minerals, now near or at the top of the decision-making menu, not only of junior and mid-level officials, but the cabinet itself? Has this filtered to the top as a key consideration?
Well, I don't know, since I'm no longer in the peanut gallery in cabinet meetings, but I would say the possibility that it's at the top of the list is virtually nil. I think not just because of COVID, but because of a variety of other reasons. Governments tend to respond to immediate issues, not to broader, longer term issues. And I think that's one of the big problems we're going to have in this area. But you can see that in many points. Complicating the issue, I mean, since China is central to this, many of our listeners will be aware that Canada does not have a comprehensive China policy. I think it's almost impossible to develop because the interests at play are so complicated and it's sometimes contradictory. But successive governments have actually avoided dealing with China and these various components, including rare earth materials. So I do think at some level in the government, there is an interest in these issues. You know, there was a recent agreement with the United States to start talking about some of the minerals that we have in our far north. But absent, I hate saying this, but sometimes in Canada, absent a crisis, it's very hard to get issues like this near the top of the agenda. Is a minister or two, perhaps the Minister of Natural Resources or the Foreign Affairs Minister aware? Possibly. The cabinet at large, I think the chances that they are aware are very slight. We need a Jeff in Canada.
Perhaps we can convince Jeff to spend a little more time on this side of the pond when travel's a little more easy. Dick, what you've talked about, it's sobering. To borrow a turn of phrase from my favorite hockey player, Mr. Gretzky, or to riff on it, I feel like Canada as a country is constantly skating to where the puck has been and not where it's going. And this issue is a profound illustration of that. In our prep sessions for this event, I can't recall whether it was Jeff or Guy. Someone made the comment that supply chain diligence only goes down to the component level. Could one of you unpack that idea, whoever would like to tackle this, and the idea again that supply chain due diligence only goes down to the component level? What does that mean, and what's the problem with that reality?
So that was me. So I'll take that one if I may, Guy. So historically, when looking at due diligence and where it fits into the defence sector in the UK government's due diligence has stopped at the component manufacturing. So there's been no government looking further up the supply chain, up to the upstream. And the problem there is obviously we're getting to a stage now where we don't have control of that midstream, the beneficiation, the specification or refining, and that's where China has really dominated vertical integration. That takes a big mindset to shift, and also a lot of extra spending within the government to change that perspective and the way that you deal with your due diligence as a nation, to say, hang on, the supply chain has to fit through all. Now, maybe that gets slightly changed as we move forward. So in the UK, we've just left the EU. We've got G7 happening this year in Cornwall, so home of places like Cornish lithium, good critical mineral opportunities. And you also have COP26 coming up at the end of the year in November. Now, what that means is actually a lot of the discussions going around COP26 and the G7 is around ESG compliance and being able to track ESG, environmental sustainability and governance, across the supply chain from where you mine it all the way through the supply chain up to the OEMs. And is that possible, and is that achievable at an international level? So I do think that there's a problem there in trying to get the government to look past its initial way of doing due diligence and just the complexity of that, but also adding that to a much broader industry approach to entire supply chain ESG compliance.
Well, we have such a wide variety of participants today that I hope we can come back to this in the Q&A session, because I think there are probably people listening in who have a lot to say about this very question, about supply chains, their frailty, the weakest links in those chains, and in fact, how long those chains actually are, inputs into inputs into inputs, and each of those links being vulnerable. So we'll hopefully come back to that topic. Still on the issue of threats or vulnerabilities, we're going to turn now to an interesting twist, which is around the environment and its elevation, at least in US policy, to a matter of national security. Many of you will know that President Biden has described climate change as a profound crisis and declared it to be a matter to be placed properly at the center of US national security policy. Catherine Raw, back to you. How do critical minerals factor into what is now viewed as a threat to America's essential security interests through the lens of the environment? And specifically, what new tensions has this focus brought, even within the strongly pro-environment circles that form the vibrant debate within U.S. policy circles?
I think it's actually fascinating to watch. So I'm going to speak from a sort of personal perspective in terms of Barrick and our operations in Nevada. So we're a joint venture partner with Newmont, operating the largest gold complex in the world. With the largest, we represent 80% of the US's gold production from our operations in northern Nevada. And what we're also seeing is these are incredibly geologically endowed mountain ranges. And what you've got is a lot of the critical minerals associated with the geology. So whether it's lithium, even we operate, one of our gold mines is copper and scandium also as byproducts. And what you're seeing is this sudden sort of identity crisis almost, which is that mining, it used to be part of the bogeyman. We were part of the natural resources space. We were often going into environmentally pristine conditions. And whilst the industry has moved on significantly over the last 30 years, our focus on conservation, our focus on mitigation, our focus on closure has completely changed. Ultimately, what we are doing is impacting pristine natural environments. And so the pressure on that from environmentalists and NGOs has always been great. And we spend a lot of our time trying to compromise, trying to work together, trying to reach a balance. And actually, it's an appropriate check and balance that exists within the sort of the system, the ecosystem of mining, that you do have environmental NGOs making sure that we stick to our commitments and deliver what we promise. The challenge, of course, is when you have the environment in the broad, climate change, how do we protect the climate? Ultimately, we need to move away from fossil fuels towards green energy, and that green energy requires mining. Green energy requires you to dig up and change often environmentally sensitive areas. And how do you deal with that trade-off? And so what's been fascinating over the last 6 to 9 months, and it's going to be even more interesting as we move into the next couple of years, is how you deal with that almost contradictory position, which is in order to protect the environment, you have, or let's rephrase it, in order to protect the global environment, you have to impact the local environment. And what are the trade-offs? What is the cost of that? And is it a cost worth paying? And it's fascinating just looking at some of the press articles coming out on a Nevada company called American Lithium, or Lithium America, which is there seeking to permit to build an open pit that's going to mine lithium, that's going to be a local US source of lithium that feeds directly into this discussion that we're having. And at the moment, they have NGOs camping on them, saying, effectively swearing over their lives that they will never see this mine get built. And how does the administration deal with this challenge? That a lot of ultimately the support that they received in getting them elected in the first place, to drive forward with a green agenda, is to actually antagonize some of their core supporters because of that impact on the local environment. Now, as a mining industry, I think it's our role and our responsibility to act as the bridge. What we need to do is mine responsibly. And we need to be able to identify that you can balance these trade-offs. And whilst you impact the environment, the mitigation measures that you put in place ultimately mean that the net effect on the environment is as limited as it can be while securing those mineral supplies. And the one comment I would also say is I think the US and Canada are incredibly lucky relative to the UK, because geologically speaking, they're still very young. The level of exploitation of mineral resources in Northern America and Southern America is relatively minor. And even if you compare it to China, the amount of natural resources available to the US and Canada that are yet to be exploited compared to China, where you're already seeing significant exploitation. If governments are able to harness this appropriately, I think effectively they can mitigate any risk, but it all comes down to actually taking action in what are incredibly controversial, sensitive and emotional topics of ultimately, do you want to have a vibrant mining industry in an economy that's forgotten about mining, where mining is micro cap relative to the service industries and tech industries that now dominate the stock market.
Guy, the same question to you. Talk to us about what you've just heard from Catherine, including about this tension within environmental circles. You have Tesla environmentalism versus those who want to protect their own backyards. How is that tension playing out both globally and in your own backyard in the UK?
I think it's really a fascinating dynamic, and it's really the dirty truth that the clean energy sector increasingly is having to face up to. Obviously, emotionally, they would love to distance themselves from the mining sector, but in actual fact, this is a commodity-driven energy transition. And so they really need to embrace that mining supply chain and actually to figure out how to work most effectively with it. And so I think, if you consider Tesla, they have had some very high profile issues in terms of the critical minerals that they employ in their products. And so for anyone who has any significant requirement for cobalt, there is a very inconvenient truth that a lot of the world's cobalt, today is still mined in the DRC. And there are some big question marks over the ESG quality of that product. And so I think it's fair enough to have a sort of a sentimental tide of enthusiasm for electric vehicles, say. But over time, as the sector comes of age, they actually have to consider the true ESG footprint of what they're doing. Similarly, it's all very well to have products that go into what is ultimately a low emissions vehicle. But what if you're using marine diesel to transport spodumene from Australia to China to process it? And so, we keep talking about supply chains, and I think that's because supply chains can hide a multitude of evils in terms of the true carbon footprint of products that on the face of it are gleaming and low emissions. And so really the whole examination of this kind of critical mineral supply chain has to actually ask some of those very inconvenient questions. You have to consider, and to pick up on what Catherine was saying, would we rather just export mining to other parts of the world, even if we're going to actually generate a lot of carbon emissions by then moving it around? And equally, would we rather have our mining operations in countries and locations where we can guarantee the ESG quality of the product? There's a great quote from Robert Friedland that there will be no one price for copper, there will be no one price for gold. Everything will be priced in relation to its ESG components. And I think that's very, very relevant to this consideration. Will we in fact decide that we should be, even if it involves paying a premium for critical minerals from countries where we can guarantee its ESG provenance in the future? So it's a fascinating debate, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how the Biden administration is going to wrap it up for us in the 100 days.
Well, Guy, this next question will come back to you, but first a couple of observations, and we are now in the portion of our agenda dealing with opportunities. The Pentagon has signed contracts with American and Australian miners to boost their onshore refining capacity and reduce their reliance on Chinese refiners. Yet we read these same refiners tend to flood the market to suppress competition. So while China's dominance in the rare earth mining space is under threat, it maintains a near monopoly in the refining process that turns ores into minerals ready for manufacture. Indeed, that country controls about 4/5 of the global rare earth refining capacity, we're told. So Guy, to you, based on what we know about the central importance of critical minerals, this is a fairly bleak picture. Is there a solution? Is there an opportunity? talk to us about critical minerals in the context both global and end of Brexit. And is the UK positioning to access critical minerals, has it been improved or diminished in a post-Brexit universe?
So I think one of the great insights that I've ever heard on how the critical minerals supply chain works was actually from an Aussie, which was, if you think about the wine industry, so France won't sell you grapes. So if you decide that you're going to go into the high value wine business, it might occur to you, if you're in the UK, say, that we have a huge grape grower just down to the south of us, but they won't sell you grapes. And the reason they won't sell you grapes is because they want to sell you Chateau Lafite. And so they are taking what fundamentally is a kind of, albeit lovingly cultivated, low grade agricultural commodity. And the real value to France is in turning those grapes into the Chateau Lafite. And so when we buy the Chateau Lafite, we're actually buying this high-end finished product with all of the value add in there, and that will all stay in France. Now, when you consider it that way, it doesn't seem quite so surprising to me that China wouldn't want to sell you rare earths. Of course they wouldn't, because, you know, fundamentally they need to employ people, and the best way to move up the value chain is for them to employ people in making wind turbines and electric vehicles. So on the one hand, I don't think that it's a particularly shocking contention that that supply from China will drop. And I think, you know, to pick up on what Dick was saying, I think we have to factor into our planning that it may drop, not just because of any sort of malignant geopolitical intent, and I'm sure that thought occurs occasionally, but fundamentally it's going to happen because we're in the middle of this unbelievable commodity-driven revolution. And, you know, wind turbines are using 10 times more primary materials than the equivalent generation per megawatt from fossil fuels. So it's not surprising that suddenly there's this major choke point in critical minerals. And I think we should probably take some of the antagonism towards China potentially out of that debate. The fact is that we are now in a position where we are competing to have those high value added renewable energy supply chains in Europe and in North America. And we're competing directly for China with that. So in the way that we can't grumble that France is not going to ship us grapes to turn into Chateau Thameside, we have to accept that we're not necessarily going to be given a leg up in terms of developing those high value permanent magnet type industries in the UK and elsewhere. But in actual fact, I think that in many ways, the solution may lie partially in that, because essentially the way it looks is that there's been this big explosion in domestic demand in China. And so if that continues, you would expect to see more price signals supporting the development of critical minerals supply chains outside China. And already we're seeing that China is actually a net importer of rare earths. So whilst we complain about whether or not we get rare earths from China, in actual fact, Mountain Pass in the US sends its rare earths to China for processing. The rare earths from Australia go to China for processing. So I would say that we should accept the challenge ourselves as to whether we're actually going to take forward that processing in our own markets. In terms of your question about Brexit, I still don't think that we need to have all of this in the UK, and we certainly don't need to have the mining. And I think in all of our planning, we would be better to focus on our relationships with Canada and Australia and other markets that we can really rely on. And so I don't think that we should pursue, as to pick up Dick's expression, a sort of anti-globalization agenda completely. we probably just need to look at where we can create a new market that isn't distorted by some of the consolidation that happened in the 2000s.
Now, Guy, when I come to visit you post-pandemic, I expect to be served some Chateau Thames side. I confess I'm slightly skeptical, but I'm willing to give it a try. You heard Dick refer to the 5 Eyes. For those who are not steeped in security intelligence issues, the 5 Eyes simply refers to the 5 key post-war allies who have agreed to some extent not to aggress or spy on each other, but instead to share intelligence and to cooperate to counter global threats to at least the Western Anglosphere. That alliance may soon expand, we hear. To either Guy or perhaps to Jeff, what would you have the 5 Eyes allies do to help foster not only industry but trade between our within this most trusted alliance?
That's a really good question. So if we look to Canada, Australia, and the UK doesn't have the minerals necessary to deliver its industrial strategy. We've got some lithium, but cobalt, etc., is not there. So I think, firstly, security of supply of feedstock is important, and again, working with Canada and Australia, who can provide that, is key. And then we're seeing a race between friends almost because of Brexit in terms of the midstream between the UK and the EU. The reality is we don't need 15 different separation plants. We probably need 3 or 4. So the UK is racing against the EU to make sure that we have one, but we're not necessarily needing all of them. So, I mean, when we talk about the 5 Eyes, New Zealand is obviously slightly on the side, although probably enough dwarves in Lord of the Rings to think there's something in the mountains there. But certainly those 3 smaller nations, Canada, the UK, and Australia, could work collaboratively to look at their role within the supply chain and where that fits internationally, but also regionally. And I think when you look to America, I mean, the American economy and its drive towards this green economy, they have such a large need themselves. The likelihood of America becoming an exporter of those critical minerals, if it does develop its own midstream, is slightly less likely. So I think it's really key that the 3 work together. And just ending on that, China is a major power in the world. And we've seen China's actions in Japan, but also on nickel a couple of years ago. When threatened, they have acted. I think if Canada, Australia, or the UK is to work independently or out of line in terms of the timings of which they deliver these things, China could easily pick off any one of those countries by itself in terms of price manipulation or suppressing supply if it wanted to. Why is that important? There's 170 gigafactories being built in the world at the moment, 172. 130 of those are in China. So in terms of its requirements for critical minerals, it's going to look after those 130 before it looks after the 42 that are outside China. And therefore, it comes to a point where you have to accept that perhaps when it comes to critical mineral supply chains, you can't stop China from dominating, but you can stop China from controlling. And that's really where the 3 working together alongside the EU and New Zealand and some other partner nations, you could create an alternative supply chain.
Catherine, I'm going to come back to you because you made such an interesting observation in our discussions on this topic. You actually made 2 observations. One is that there are, of course, unforeseen consequences of state intervention. And secondly, you use the phrase, all of this has happened before, and in other contexts, in other crises. Can you just speak to those 2 points?
Yeah, well, so again, I was talking from our experience within Barrick. So Barrick's grown through acquisition. And one of the big acquisitions we did was Homestake Resources, which was a famous, long-lived US mining company. And as a consequence of that acquisition, I am now responsible for over 32 closure properties, of which a portion of those are uranium, lead mining, really the boom of mining in the 50s, 60s, and 70s that was driven by the Cold War, and ultimately had a huge amount of government intervention in order to encourage the mining of strategic minerals in order to deliver into the weapons race as a part of the Cold War. And the reason I talk about it, we've seen it all before, is because ultimately this is a mini version of that. It may not be, well, it might be even colder, if that's the right phrase, but essentially what we're recognizing is that you have, these large global powers with their own motivations that may not be aligned with ours, whatever the definition of ours is. At the moment, I'm speaking as North American because I'm based out of Toronto, but as you can tell, I'm not actually American. But the reason I talk about this is because the environmental impact of that rush to deliver and the consequence of not having proper regulations in place, have had huge consequences, and ultimately responsible companies like ours are dealing with it. But there is a significant issue in the US around abandoned mine lands and the environmental impact on that of local communities. And so the caution I would just that I was referring to the other day was that we need to make sure that we look at the unintended consequences of government interference, because the problem, I need to be careful, I'm a little cynical. So the challenge with governments is that, as we just discussed, that the almost myopic focus on the problem that needs to be solved means that the broader checks and balances are sometimes overrun deliberately in order to solve that problem. But the consequence of that, particularly with something like mining, which is a permanent impact on the environment, that has to be mitigated, and the best time to mitigate it is at the time of mining, is that it can leave both communities, and particularly what we've seen is Indigenous communities, so whether it's Native American or First Nation communities in Canada, disenfranchised. It can impact the environment, as I've already talked about, but it can also impact the sort of socio-economic context within a region that those mines have existed. And so being able to take all of that into account, particularly during a period where ESG is now such an important part of the way we run businesses, governments have just as much responsibility to manage that as the private industry does. And one of my biggest frustrations when you look at legacy decisions is that governments have not taken that responsibility seriously, and private mining companies and the mining industry are left with the burden of those shared decisions. Ultimately, it takes two to tango. And the mining industry of the past would not have been able to do what it did without a government policy that allowed it. And so that was my comment, which was really around making sure that any actions we're taking today to deal with this specific issue of critical minerals also takes into account all of the other interrelated factors that ultimately will be impacted as a result.
Well, as we come to the beginning of our question period, we'll address one more question under the rubric of opportunity, but it will obviously sound to many of you as a threatening thing. Dick Fadden, I'm going to put this to you, and in fact, it's a question that I think I've been asking you in some format or other for the past 10 plus years, and it's this: can we really trust our allies? You see in the executive order, President Biden referring to allied and partner actions, including whether the United States and allies and partners have also identified and prioritized the critical goods and materials and other essential goods and materials identified in the order, and possible avenues for international engagement. And of course, this has always been our format and our hope with our closest allies, that we could work together to tackle the most difficult problems. Can we do that, or has COVID been the ultimate wake-up call? Is anyone else truly in the same boat? And I will ask this from a Canada-centric perspective. Can we cooperate, or are we in some way going it alone? And here I think of the various junctures in the pandemic, where even as we look to our closest allies, and we could classify closest in a variety of ways, geographically closest, we haven't always gotten along during the pandemic with the United States at every juncture. And so let me put that to you. Should we be seeking further cooperation and interdependence with our closest allies? Or does Canada really need to maturely look at going it alone in certain respects?
Well, I think the beginning of an answer to your question has to be based in reality. I don't think that we can handle the various and sundry issues that we've talked about alone. It's just not practical. And in that respect, I join Jeff in thinking that Australia, the UK, and the US are the people we should deal with. But I also think that in answering your question, we have to be careful to remember that our allies and ourselves are only going to collaborate to the extent that we do not put at risk clear domestic interests. Everybody wants the United States to do this, that, and the other thing in respect of themselves. In Canada's case, we were very distressed because President Biden canceled a permit to build that large pipeline down to Texas. Well, it did not surprise me at all because he had vital political interest that could not be squared with the maintenance of that pipeline. So as long as there's no vital domestic interest at play, I do think you can do everything that you've talked about. The key, I think, is going to be to reduce dependency of one individual country to the extent that we can rely on more than one other. And to the point that was made earlier, I really do think that China is not going to close down its borders for everyone. But what the West needs to do, I think, is to reduce dependency to the point where we can function without China if we have to. But in the end, and you know this more than I do, Andrew, because you've played in the political world, no government, democracy, is going to put at risk its success in the next election or the ongoing support of its population. If vital interests have to be sacrificed in order to make the UK or Canada or Australia happy, or vice versa. So we should absolutely, I think, go forward because our history is very positive. We've dealt with a number of crises over the decades by doing what you're suggesting. But I think we have to be realistic as well. And that realism has to take into account the domestic political situation. I mean, if you just look at the United States, the US president barely controls the Senate. In 2 years' time, he may lose control, or his party may lose control of the House of Representatives. And what does that mean for us? It means a great deal of uncertainty at a minimum, and perhaps not the domestic comfort level that we would need to do some of the things you're talking about. But notwithstanding all that, we should try.
Well, look, you raise an excellent point. We've spoken extensively about China today. It's true that China is a country that knows how to make a plan. In many of our Western democracies, we tend very much to plan in 4-year cycles. There's some very obvious political reasons for that. Survival of the country and well-being of the country doesn't always align perfectly with the survival of a particular political party or movement. And that is the source, I think, of a great deal of trouble when we look at critical minerals and other forms of critical infrastructure. Guy Winter, are there specific opportunities for Canada or for the UK when it comes to critical minerals? And is there anything our two countries can do together? And here I'm sort of asking about specific minerals or specific projects, ways in which we could maintain that very healthy trade and political relationship that would support both countries. Is there room for others in that relationship as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting that it doesn't take much of a threat before one is ready to throw out incredibly long-held tenets of one's national history. So if you consider that, the UK and Canada has been a free market country, in its absolute essence, and that really is where everything good came from. And obviously China has got a completely different perspective. And, maybe we shouldn't be too quick to completely throw out all of our faith in the free market. Perhaps what makes more sense is if you consider what's gone wrong, where the challenges have come in the critical minerals market, it's actually because of distortions due to state intervention in other locations. So perhaps the free market principles can still be expressed in terms of using the relative strengths of each of the kind of coalition of the willing that we have, between the UK, Australia, Canada, and the United States. And so we can, by collaborating, we can potentially use our relative strengths. So if you look at Canada, it ticks a lot of boxes in terms of a critical minerals partner. So, you know, there's this central trilemma throughout the whole of the energy supply chain: security of supply, and we can see obviously that Canada has got very ample natural resources. Sustainability, we can see that Canada obviously has a very sophisticated mining sector that has developed sophisticated ESG reporting and compliance. And then in terms of affordability, if there is going to be a kind of ESG premium, then in actual fact, Canada may be a very natural place to export critical minerals. In terms of what the UK can bring, obviously historically and today, it's a very significant capital market. That we are trying to build a supply chain for new energy, for electric vehicles and for wind turbines. So there's very significant offtake opportunity. And one aspect that we haven't really touched on so far in this discussion is actually the circular economy aspects in terms of recycling technology, where a lot of really interesting work is being done in terms of research into how we can recover more critical minerals from what is currently wasted and landfilled resources. So if you look at those different strands, there's actually a lot of planning that could be done together between our countries to our mutual benefit. And I think we shouldn't give up quite yet on globalization, but it may be that sadly there are two globes for a while. And so what we may see as a sort of Western free world that is willing to commit to a free market and to put its faith in globalization, we might have to operate that market slightly differently from the controlled markets that exist in some other regions of the world.
What I'd like to do now is just turn to some questions from some of our attendees, and this can go to any of our panelists. It does have to do with Canada-US interdependency and cooperation. And here's the question: as Canada develops its own critical minerals action plan, which is underway right now, what is the strongest case or factors or considerations that Canadian industry or government can present to the United States government as part of our case to the Americans to essentially make sure that Canada is treated fairly? And I think this is posed in the context of Buy American, and it specifically focuses on the defense industrial base. Is Canada's production of critical minerals a point of leverage for Canada as we face increased US protectionism? And I'll throw that open to the panel, anyone who'd like to jump in on this.
May I give it a try?
Please.
One of the things that I find interesting about Canada's relationship with the United States is that by and large, we approach the United States with a list of things we want from them. We do this, all governments, over the decades. And I think in part it's because they're the larger partner, the bigger partner. But to answer your question, I think we have to ask ourselves, what does the United States want from Canada, both in respect of critical minerals, but also more generally? It cannot be a one-sided exercise. And I think sometimes we forget that. And it goes back to the point I was trying to make a few minutes ago, which is that if we want an agreement with the United States in terms of Canada developing these minerals, there has to be a domestic interest in respect of the United States that will incite the government of the United States to collaborate with us. I don't think that's particularly difficult to do, because we can take this particular issue and point out that there have been any number of other issues where we become entirely interoperable. You know, for example, the electrical grid or the digital communication grid in North America is entirely interoperable. It's as if the border didn't exist. So there's a base for all of this. But I come back to the point that if we're going to make this work, and I think it can work, we have to ask ourselves, we Canadians, what can we provide the United States other than just the minerals And what do they want from us other than that? Because to a point that I think Catherine was making earlier, we have to stop looking at these issues in narrow silos and look more broadly at how we can bring about collaboration and cooperation and sharing beyond this particular area of interest.
Thanks, Dick. And here's a question for Catherine, addressed to her by one of our attendees. Wrapped up in the balance between global environment and local environment are questions of equity, and in many places this means resolving indigenous land rights and decolonization issues. Catherine, I think the question is simply asking you to expand on some very good points you made around the tension between people who want to do good things for the environment generally and globally, and those who are adamant that we resolve those things which are unresolved at the local level. Speaking either from your personal perspective or that of your professional affiliation, how have you dealt with some of these issues, and how do you think governments have dealt with these issues as they balance what are some pretty sharply competing objectives, particularly in light of the new American emphasis on environment as a matter of security?
Well, it's an incredibly important topic, and I could wax lyrical for hours, but I won't. But I think one of the biggest challenges, to be brutally honest, around mining in the US and Canada over the next few years is the resetting of that relationship with our partners, the Native Americans and First Nations, because ultimately what we have to recognize is that historical mining and government policy towards mining has essentially ignored them as having a right to be in the conversation around the exploitation of resources up until really only the last, well, probably the 2000s was when I can speak from the experience of Barrick and some of the challenges in terms of developing new mines. And in the past, it's always been slightly adversarial. There hasn't been a commitment to engagement on either side, to be brutally honest. But I think particularly that the mining industry bears a lot of responsibility for that because it didn't need to. Essentially, it engaged with governments. Governments gave it permission. If it had permission, it could do what it liked. And what's changed, and I think this is a much broader issue, is the fact that we now live in a transparent, social media driven world in which ultimately the smallest minority has a voice in a way that was just not true in previous decades. We cannot operate in the way that we have operated historically. That doesn't mean that we cannot operate full stop. What it means is the way in which we engage, the way in which we consider who our stakeholders are, and how we deal with that has to be very different. But the natural consequence of that is that it may take longer. And it has a requirement for both sides to be truly partners and approach it as partners and understand that there is risk and reward, not just reward, associated with developing mining operations. And so I think the biggest challenge I see from my role as COO of North America is trying to navigate or chart a course through that ultimately delivers mining operations, minerals, and shareholder value, while at the same time recognizing that the complexity associated with who are the stakeholders and what is the definition of value is going to be increasingly fraught and complex. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, other than the question is exactly the thing that we are grappling most with as we go into this next generation of mining projects, because ultimately historical mining, particularly in mines like copper, where you have much longer mine lives, this is a new phenomenon. And if you look at Rio and Freeport and their new project in Arizona in Resolution, the challenges that's going to face to get into production over the next few years are going to be enormous. That the hurdle of the government and transferring it to private land is just the first step. And yet copper is one of the most strategic, most critical minerals towards the green economy. And so navigating that and ensuring that everyone comes out feeling that they've had their voice heard and that they benefit from the development of that operation is going to be key.
Let me ask the group a question about criticality itself. And Jeff, maybe I'll put this to you first, and others may want to jump in. Is it always a good thing to have the substance in which you are interested in be designated as critical? And a follow-up to that, why do different countries have different lists of what's critical? The US list, I think it lists 35 critical minerals. It is not an identical list to Canada. And interestingly, and for those looking at their session packages, you'll see a list of Canadian critical minerals. Go to the bottom of that document in very small print. Natural Resource Canada describes the list as being the list of minerals critical to allies, not necessarily critical to Canada. And Jeff, I think this ties back to something you mentioned as you opened the session around the definition of criticality. Sometimes it has to do with your own domestic supply, and sometimes we measure these things in absolute terms. Barrick mines gold. Gold is not listed as a critical mineral. It's a very valuable mineral, but not necessarily critical. Is it a problem to have your substance listed as critical? Does it bring regulatory challenges that are actually not in your economic interest? And how are these things decided nation by nation?
Really good three set of questions there. So let's start with probably the end and move backwards. So the UK and America are very much driving towards becoming developers and builders of this green economy. So the component manufacturers, gigafactories, etc. That's fundamental. The UK wants to be the Saudi Arabia of wind power by 2030. So therefore, our necessity for industrial magnets, rare earth magnets, is increasingly important. So our critical mineral list is directly tied to those industrial ambitions of the green economy, but also to our defense sector, which is also very large. Now, we're not really producers of critical minerals. We've got some exciting projects that may bear fruition in the future, specifically down in the southwest of the UK, but we're not going to be an exporter of critical minerals at a massive global scale. Canada and Australia are, and the percentage of the economy of Canada and Australia directly linked to minerals and their export is much higher. So of course, Australia and Canada's critical mineral list may be aligned to where their offtake would go to, and therefore the percentage back to the economy of that. So I think the overall economic objectives of the nation fundamentally determines the criticality of those lists. Like I say, the EU and the UK is almost identical, which is very similar to America's. I think Canada and Australia have a more aligned look at this. So I think that's when we're discussing critical minerals and how you get to these critical mineral lists. I think that's the key. And now I've forgotten the other two questions you asked.
I think, in fact, you've covered off most of what I was asking, but I suppose it was a technical question about how different countries make the decision around criticality. But then, which you've answered. But secondly, is it a disadvantage if you are engaged in marketplace activity which suddenly becomes designated as critical? You can ask anyone in a federally regulated industry in Canada; they will tell you it's tough. If you're in the telecom sector, pharma, mining. You can land yourself unwittingly or against your wishes in a regulatory situation that makes your life far more complex and therefore profitability a larger question mark. One might think it's good to be critical. Is there a downside?
Yes, there probably is. So again, the critical mineral list, if you ask companies, that's shifting as R&D comes in, that shifts on a yearly basis. So that list, it might be set now, but actually at a national level, but could be out of date within 2-3 months time. And again, that won't be changed. That probably wouldn't be looked at again for another 2 years in a government context. So that's also an issue. And then would it become difficult? Well, I guess across the whole, and Catherine's probably better at answering this than me, but we have such a large spotlight now on the mining industry as a whole in terms of ESG. And I think certainly being involved in conversations around G7 and COP26, the importance of ESG at an international level is now so high and being discussed at those levels that ultimately that is going to come back into discussions around the mining sector. So as we get added to, if you find yourself on a critical mineral list, A, the government's going to keep an eye on you because they need your product, and B, they're going to keep an eye on you because they want to make sure that you're adhering to a vast array of ESG that hasn't really been, we're at the beginning of the evolution of the ESG, movement, and we don't really have an agreed international standard. So again, there becomes some complexity around that. So yeah, it might be beneficial to be on that list in terms of getting some government support if the government's willing to help. Equally, you've really got to play by the book and make sure that everything ticks the 1,000,000 pages of due diligence that they're looking for.
So Andrew, maybe just can I comment, speaking from experience? Mining is already under huge scrutiny from, well, particularly the Canadian government. I'm presuming the same for the UK government with the UK listed companies. I think if that point Jeff makes around ESG and what's expected of international companies and how they operate globally, if they're listed or domiciled from a developed country, the level of regulation, the level of engagement, you have a Canadian ombudsman that's been set up to make sure that Canadian companies, natural resource companies operating globally, are operating appropriately. Whether it's tailings dam failures, whether it's Australian Indigenous communities, the pressure on the mining industry, whether you're critical or not, is so significant that I think really there's only a net benefit in being identified as a producer of a critical mineral, because it ultimately therefore delivers a purpose and a sense of contributing to a greater whole that is otherwise ignored. The problem I have, I'm quite impassioned about this. Mining is a primary industry. No other industries would exist without mining. And yet no one or very few people ever recognize the significance of that. What critical minerals policy is now pointing out is that you cannot deliver a sophisticated, developed world economy without mining. And so the net benefit of that, I believe, overrides any regulatory burden associated with it.
Really important, and certainly increasingly important as we work through what is hopefully a recovery or entry into recovery from the pandemic. Guy or Dick, any final comments from either of you as we come to the end of our session?
I guess I would just pick up on what Catherine was saying there. There's a wonderful opportunity, for the mining sector to embrace that role in that renewable energy supply chain. And I wonder whether that's something that could be articulated more in the sort of messaging, particularly when some of these conversations have to be had in terms of weighing up the relative virtues of mining operations in different locations. Just that explicit connection to what most people probably now regard as universal goods in terms of generating renewable energy and driving electric vehicles. But, mining is obviously just the absolute essential building block for all of that technology.
And Dick, the final word to you.
Thanks. I'm going to try and continue my role as the Darth Vader of this panel. One of the things that Catherine mentioned a few minutes ago was that, all of this is seeing a repetition of history. And one of the things I think we tend to forget is we are actually right now in a weapons race on this planet. Russia, China, and the United States are spending trillions of dollars on increasingly sophisticated weapon system, all of which require the minerals that we're talking about. I mentioned this simply to say that the future is not predictable. We all know that. And I agree with virtually everything my colleagues on the panel have said, but I come back to the point, we have to, I think, include in our planning, our thinking, our negotiations, the possibility that, as someone said, we may end up in a spheres of influence planet over the course of the next little while. That is not good news, but it may reflect reality. But I don't think any of this, all of our geopolitical concerns, should prevent people from talking and trying to work out arrangements. But what worries me more than anything right now is the increasingly proactive / aggressive approach that the government of China is taking on virtually all of its files. President Xi has introduced an approach for China that we have not seen out of China in the last 30 years, 40 years. And I don't think the West has come to grips with this. For those people who have the misfortune of listening to me talk about national security more directly, I argue that one of the great problems we have in the world today is what I call the dysfunctional West. I continue to think that that's a real problem. And virtually everybody here talked about that, is we think that collaboration amongst the West is the wonderful thing. The Five Eyes is irritating as hell, if you'll forgive my language, to the French and the Germans, and to some degree the Australians. NATO, in similar fashion, includes some people everybody would like to throw out. We are very dysfunctional in the West right now in terms of moving together on a variety of files. And I think in order to correct this, we're going to have to make sure that our governments are aware of the points that have just been made, which is a good and effectively functioning mining industry is a precondition to society as we know it today. And I would argue that that view is not shared universally. Anyway, thank you.
A great note to end on. I'm not sure if it's a high note or a low note, Dick, but you've done what you've done exactly what you've always done, which is to speak your mind. And I appreciate you being here with us today. And to all of our panelists, fascinating discussion on a topic that in its importance has been so keenly illustrated in the last year. Of course, we're in March. This is the anniversary of the commencement of the pandemic. For many of us, it marks 1 year in confinement at home. I've described the COVID-19 era to friends as an unsatisfying pandemic. And what I mean by that is it's a medical threat serious enough to disrupt almost every aspect of normal life, but not quite deadly enough to put to rest the debates which have seemed to rage about how to address it. But I think I've likely been quite wrong. Instead, COVID-19 has probably been a dress rehearsal for a situation that may ultimately be far worse. I hope this does not occur in our generation. I think we've now done our part, and I hope this comes to an end quickly. But there have been some incredibly important lessons about what's truly important, be it quality time with family and loved ones, or as we've talked about today, securing the supply of the critical building blocks of our economy. It's been a chance to finally begin to get serious about what's needed to get by when the chips are truly down, and without being unduly ominous, make a plan while we still can. I hope today has been the start or probably continuation of that conversation for those who have joined us as attendees. I'd like to just offer a special thanks to our team here at Fasken, Lauren Klosterman, Mac Darnley, Neil Jacobs, and Laura Conkle for all your help in putting this together. And of course, the broader PDAC team led by my colleague, Michael Barassa. And particularly thanks to all of you who've joined us, have given of your time and your attention. I hope you have a great day, and I wish you all the best in staying healthy and well. Thanks very much for joining us.